My father has a painting in his penthouse office on the 43rd floor of the Sterling Tower in Midtown Manhattan. It's an original oil portrait, commissioned, not purchased, of himself. It hangs directly behind his desk, maybe 8 feet tall, so that anyone who sits across from him during a meeting is forced to look at two versions of Charles Sterling at the same time, the one in the chair and the immortalized one on the canvas above him. Same cold gray eyes, same slight downward tilt of the chin that was never humility. It was always appraisal, like he was perpetually deciding whether you were worth his time. I grew up in the shadow of that painting. I grew up in the shadow of the man. And for most of my life, I told myself that was just how love worked when it came from someone like him, that it was conditional and architectural, something you had to earn, maintain, and constantly prove yourself worthy of. I told myself the distance was sophistication, that his silence after my college graduation was stoicism, not indifference, that his refusal to attend my thesis defense was a scheduling conflict, not a message. I was very, very good at rewriting his cruelty into something I could survive. Then I met Ethan, and Ethan, bless him, ruined everything in the best possible way. Ethan Calloway is a pediatric nurse at New York Presbyterian. He grew up in Columbus, Ohio, in a house with a vegetable garden in the backyard and a dog named Biscuit, who apparently lived to be 17 years old, which Ethan still brings up with the kind of reverence most people reserve for war heroes. He drives a used Honda Civic with a cracked dashboard and a bobblehead of a golden retriever on the console. He makes about $62,000 a year before taxes and considers himself incredibly fortunate because of it. He is the most genuinely happy person I have ever met in my entire life. We met at a charity event, one of those fundraiser galas in the lobby of a museum on the Upper West Side, where the champagne is overpriced and everyone is dressed to be photographed. He was there as part of the hospital's pediatric oncology team, representing the ward. I was there because my father had sent me as a proxy since he had a last-minute conflict that I later learned was a golf weekend in Connecticut. Ethan spent the whole evening kneeling down to talk to the kids from the ward who were well enough to attend. He learned all their names. He remembered which one liked dinosaurs and which one had a pet hamster and which one was obsessed with a particular cartoon. He wasn't performing for the room. He wasn't networking. He was just present. Wholly, completely present for a group of small, sick children in a room full of people who were mostly there to be seen. I watched him for 45 minutes before I said a word to him. When I finally did, I walked over and said, "You're the most interesting person here." He looked up, a little surprised, and said, "I genuinely doubt that, but I appreciate the kind lie." Then he smiled, and that was it. I was finished. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. He proposed at Riverside Park on a Sunday morning in October, in the middle of a run, because we'd been talking about our future the way you do when you both already know the answer, and you're just enjoying the conversation. He stopped on the path, reached into the pocket of his running jacket, and pulled out a ring that he'd bought at an estate jewelry store in the West Village. Small, antique, perfect. And he said, "I've been carrying this for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment, and I've decided there is no right moment. There's just this moment. And I love you, Chloe. I want to build a life with you." I said yes before he finished the sentence. I was, of course, terrified to tell my father. Charles Starling's disapproval arrived in the form it always did, not as an explosion, but as a temperature drop, a glacial cooling that you felt in your bones before you could name it. I told him over dinner at his penthouse. His assistant had arranged it. White tablecloth, private chef, the whole performance. And I watched his face do that thing it does when he receives information he has categorized as beneath consideration. A small tightening around the eyes, a pause before the next sip of wine that was just a half-second too long. "Charles Sterling," he said, and the way he said it, flat and precise, you would have thought he was reading a name off a document he intended to file and forget.
"Yes," I said, "he's wonderful. You'd know that if you'd ever—"
A nurse, he set his glass down. You're telling me you want to marry a nurse? A pediatric nurse, I said, as if the distinction would matter to him. It did not. Chloe. He folded his hands on the table with the patience of a man who had closed 1,000 deals and knew that silence was a weapon. I have spent 30 years building something, a legacy, a name that carries weight in this city, in this country. I have connections, positions, a board seat at... I know your resume, Dad. Then you understand, he said, that this is not about my ego. It is about your future. You are a Sterling. That name has value. That value has expectations attached to it, and a pediatric nurse from Columbus, Ohio is not what? I asked. Rich enough? Well-connected enough? From the right family? He looked at me with that portrait painting gaze. All three, he said, without apology. I went home and cried in the shower so Ethan wouldn't hear me. The next morning, I was fine. I'd learned, somewhere in my early 20s, how to grieve my father without letting him know he'd made me bleed. The months that followed were a campaign. Charles Sterling did not accept defeat in any theater, business, politics, personal, and he had decided my engagement was a hostile acquisition he intended to block. First came the subtle attempts. He had his assistant arrange lunches with the sons of his associates, carefully curated young men from investment banking and private equity, who showed up at the restaurant already knowing too much about me, which meant my father had briefed them, which made the whole thing feel less like a coincidence and more like a cattle call. I ate the lunches, I smiled politely, I went home to Ethan. Then came the money. He called me into the office on a Tuesday afternoon. My father never called, he summoned. And when I sat down across from that portrait of him, he slid a document across the desk. A single page, clean, formal, prepared by someone in legal. A trust fund, he said. $5 million. Liquid. Available to you immediately with a one-time supplemental gift of $2 million upon the 1-year anniversary of, he paused, the dissolution of your current engagement. I stared at the paper for a long time. You're trying to pay me to break up with my fiancé, I said. I'm offering you financial security appropriate to your name and your future, he said. That's the same thing, I said. You just used more syllables. I slid the paper back across the desk, stood up, and left without another word. 2 weeks later, he stopped being subtle. It was a Thursday evening when he called me to the office again. I almost didn't go. Ethan, who has the emotional intelligence of someone who has spent years sitting with frightened children in hospital beds, said quietly, "You should hear him out, not for his sake, for yours, so you know exactly where he stands." He was right, as he so often is. So I went. It was 8 o'clock at night, and the office was lit with the particular cold light that high-rises use after hours, all fluorescent and ruthless, no warmth anywhere. My father was standing at the window when I walked in, looking out at the Manhattan skyline like it owed him something. The portrait behind his desk was more ominous at night, the oil paint catching the light in a way that made the eyes seem alive. He didn't turn around right away. Another power move. Make them wait. Make them feel the weight of the room. I had seen him do it in 100 meetings. I sat down and waited. When he turned, his face was composed in the particular way it got when he had already decided on an outcome and was simply announcing it. "The wedding is in 2 weeks, he said. "I'm aware," I said. "I planned it." "I've been patient," he said, walking to his desk and sitting with the deliberate slowness of someone who wanted you to understand they were never in a hurry. "I've offered you reason, I've offered you alternatives, I've offered you financial provision. You've declined all of it." "Because I'm marrying the man I love," I said. That's generally how weddings work." He leaned forward, and for the first time in the conversation, the composed mask cracked, not into emotion, but into something colder, something calculated and final. "Here is what is going to happen," he said. "You are going to call me before that wedding. You are going to acknowledge that this engagement is a mistake. You are going to ask for my blessing in terms that make clear you understand what you're risking by defying me. Or," he let the words sit in the air, "I will not attend that wedding. I will not walk you down the aisle. You will stand at those doors in front of every significant family, every business associate, every member of New York society that we know, and you will walk alone, and every single person in that room will understand exactly why." The room was very quiet. I could hear the distant sound of the city 43 floors below, and I thought about all the noise down there, all the people moving through the night, none of them knowing that up here, a man was trying to use his daughter's wedding as a mechanism for control. I looked at my father for a long, long moment. I thought about the graduation he didn't attend, the thesis defense, the Sunday dinners that were always rescheduled, the birthdays that were acknowledged with a card signed by his assistant. I thought about being 7 years old and showing him a drawing, and watching him glance at it without really seeing it, the way you glance at a piece of mail before you drop it in the trash. I thought about Ethan, who had framed a terrible, lopsided watercolor I'd painted at a charity art class and hung it on the wall of our apartment without any irony at all, just because I'd made it. I stood up. "Okay," I said. My father blinked. The word had not been what he expected. He'd expected tears or negotiation or pleading. "Okay," he said. "Okay," I repeated. "I heard you. Goodbye, Dad." And I walked out of Sterling Tower and stood on the sidewalk in the November cold and breathed the sharp, diesel-tinged Manhattan air and felt, I want to describe this precisely, I felt the last fragile thread of a story I'd been telling myself about my father finally, mercifully snap. The story where he loved me in a complicated way, the story where his cruelty was actually protection, the story where someday, if I was good enough and patient enough, he would see me. It was gone, and in its place was something I hadn't expected at all. Clarity. I didn't tell Ethan the full extent of it that night. I told him my father and I had spoken, that he wasn't going to walk me down the aisle, and that I was okay. Ethan held my face in his hands, those careful, gentle hands, trained to take blood pressure and change IV lines and calm down terrified 4-year-olds, and he looked at me and said, "Are you sure you're okay?" "I'm going to be better than okay," I said. "I just need to make one phone call." He raised an eyebrow. "Should I be worried?" "Not even slightly," I said. "Go to sleep." I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after he fell asleep. I thought about what I knew of narcissists, of men like my father. I thought about the architecture of their egos, how enormous they are, how fortified, how seemingly impenetrable. And then I thought about their vulnerabilities, which are, if you look closely, actually enormous, because a narcissist's ego is not a fortress. It is a performance. And the thing about a performance is that it can be interrupted. My father's greatest fear was not financial ruin. It was not legal trouble. It was not even death. It was humiliation, specifically public humiliation, specifically being diminished in front of the people whose opinions he had organized his entire identity around. I needed to find the single person in New York whose presence could accomplish that more completely than anyone else. Which is how I ended up calling Victor Vance. If Charles Sterling was the king of the room in most spaces, Victor Vance was the reason Charles Sterling couldn't sleep. Victor was 71 years old, silver-haired, built like a man who had been athletic in his youth and had maintained it through sheer stubbornness in old age. He had founded Vance Capital Partners decades ago and had, over the course of a legendary career, outmaneuvered, outbid, or simply outlasted nearly every significant financial competitor in the Eastern Seaboard. He and my father had been in opposition for 15 years, a rivalry so intense and so thoroughly documented in the business press that they'd been profiled together in the Journal, the Times, and twice in Fortune. My father despised Victor Vance with a particular concentrated passion that I always secretly suspected contained a large measure of fear. Victor was better connected, older moneyed, and operated with a kind of effortless authority that my father, for all his wealth, had never quite been able to replicate. My father had made his money, Victor had inherited his, and then tripled it, which in the circles they moved in carried a different kind of weight. Victor also had the one quality my father fundamentally lacked and would never understand. He was universally liked, not respected out of fear, actually genuinely liked. Getting a meeting with Victor Vance was the kind of thing that required either a significant introduction or a significant reason. I had neither. What I had was a letter, handwritten, sent to his private office address, which I obtained from a contact at a firm my father had introduced me to years earlier, never imagining the information would be used against him. The letter was 2 paragraphs. In the first, I introduced myself as Charles Sterling's daughter and explained that I was getting married in 2 weeks and that my father had refused to walk me down the aisle as a mechanism of control and manipulation. In the second, I explained that I was looking for someone with a stature to replace him and that I had a very specific candidate in mind and that the candidate was Victor Vance himself. Then I wrote, I understand this is an unusual request. I also understand you are an unusual man. I think you'll find, if you give me 20 minutes, that this situation has a kind of elegance to it that you might appreciate. He called me 48 hours later. We met at a restaurant in the West 50s, quiet, understated, the kind of place that powerful people choose specifically because it isn't showy. I arrived early and sat facing the door because I wanted to see him walk in. He arrived exactly on time, which I later came to understand was a thing with him. He was never early, never late, always precisely punctual, in a way that communicated a different kind of power than fashionable lateness. He was taller than I expected. He moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had not been in a hurry for decades. He sat down across from me, looked at me for a moment with dark, perceptive eyes, and said, "You look like your father." "I know," I said. "I've been working on that." He laughed, a real laugh, not a polite one, and I knew immediately that we were going to get along. I told him everything. I laid it out plainly and without self-pity. The years of conditional love, the bribe, the ultimatum, the night in the office. I told him what my father had said about Ethan, and I described Ethan to him. The hospital ward, the Columbus childhood, the cracked Honda Civic, the way he knelt down to talk to sick children at eye level. Victor listened without interrupting once. He had the rare quality of complete attention, no checking his phone, no glancing around the room, no polite but distracted nodding. He was actually listening. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you want from me exactly?" "I want you to walk me down the aisle at my wedding 2 weeks from Saturday in front of everyone my father has spent his career trying to impress." Victor looked at me steadily. "You understand what that does to your relationship with your father." "My father already ended our relationship when he gave me an ultimatum," I said. "I'm not destroying anything. I'm just choosing who stands beside me." "And you want it to be me," he said, "specifically because it will devastate him." I met his gaze. "I want it to be you because you're the one person in this city whose presence will communicate, without a single word, that I am not alone, and I am not humiliated, and I am not the one who should be ashamed." He was quiet for another moment, then a slow smile spread across his face. "Your father," he said, "always underestimated the intelligence of the people around him. It was his greatest professional failing." He picked up his water glass. It appears he made the same mistake personally. He agreed that evening. Over the following 2 weeks, we had 2 more brief meetings, and I discovered that Victor Vance was, beneath the legend, a genuinely fair-minded and warm person who had simply been forged by decades of opposition into someone who appeared harder than he was. He told me at our second meeting that he had a daughter who died young, a car accident many years ago, and that walking a young woman down an aisle was not something he was going to refuse on principle. I did not cry in front of him, but it was close. The wedding was held at the Aldercroft Estate on Long Island, a landmark property that had been converted into a premier venue, all white stone and rolling grounds, and a ceremony hall with floor-to-ceiling arched windows that caught the winter light in a way that made everything look like a painting. We had 220 guests. I had originally pictured a smaller wedding, but given the circumstances, Ethan and I had agreed that scale had its own message. The morning of the wedding, I stood in the bridal suite and watched my bridesmaids, my closest friends, my 2 cousins, bustle around me, and I thought about my father, not with grief exactly, with something more complicated, something that acknowledged all the years and all the moments and all the rewritten cruelties, and then set them gently down, the way you set down a heavy bag at the end of a very long trip. I thought about the girl in his penthouse office who had learned to make herself smaller to avoid disappointing him. I thought about the woman who had sat across from him 2 weeks ago and said, "Okay," with a steadiness that surprised even her. I thought about Ethan, somewhere on the other side of the estate, probably nervous in the way genuinely good people get nervous. Not about the commitment, but about the ceremony, about tripping or mispronouncing something or crying before the vows, which he absolutely was going to do, and which I absolutely loved him for. I was ready. My father arrived 40 minutes before the ceremony. I know this because my wedding coordinator, who had been fully briefed, texted me a single word. He's here. He was dressed, of course, impeccably. Navy suit, silver tie, cufflinks that I recognized from a gift I'd given him years ago, which struck me as either sentimental or strategic, and with Charles Sterling, it was always difficult to tell. He sat in the front row, left side, directly in the line of sight of the aisle. He sat with the composed, upright posture of a man who had arrived to watch a spectacle. He greeted the guests around him with the practiced warmth he reserved for public appearances, the handshakes, the measured smiles, the brief exchanges that said, "Yes, I am here. Yes, everything is fine. Yes, this is entirely within my control." He had not been told about Victor Vance. No one had. It was the one piece of information I had protected with absolute discipline over the 2 weeks of planning. The guests knew only that I had arranged for a family friend to escort me. My coordinator knew Victor's name, but had been asked not to share it. The venue staff had been told simply that the escort was arriving separately. The ceremony was due to begin at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. At 1:58, Victor Vance appeared at the back of the estate. He was wearing a charcoal suit that had clearly been made for him. The cut was that particular kind of perfect that cannot be achieved by anything other than a bespoke tailor who has been dressing the same man for years. He had a white pocket square, no tie, silver at his temples catching the winter light. He was 71 years old, and he walked into that space like he owned it. Not with arrogance, but with the absolute natural authority of a man who had never needed to perform confidence, because he simply had it. He found me waiting in the antechamber off the main hall, and he held out his arm. "Ready?" he said. "Since the moment I left his office," I said. He smiled. "Then let's go." The double doors of the ceremony hall opened. The music began, a string quartet, live, playing an arrangement that swelled in a way that I had specifically requested because I wanted the sound to fill that room completely. The light through the arched windows was the pale gold of a Long Island afternoon in winter, and the hall was full of 220 people in their finest, and the flowers were everywhere, white and deep green, and at the end of the aisle, Ethan was standing at the altar. He saw me first. I watched his face go soft and bright and a little undone in exactly the way I'd known it would, and he pressed his lips together for a second in the way he does when he's trying not to cry. And I loved him so fiercely in that moment that the rest of the room almost ceased to exist. Almost. Because then the murmur moved through the guests like a wave. A ripple at first, the people in the back rows who had turned to watch me enter and recognized my escort. Then it moved forward, row by row, that particular quality of collective astonishment that moves through a room when something is happening that no one anticipated. A susurrus of whispers, of quietly inhaled breath, of the rustling that happens when 200 people simultaneously shift in their seats. That's Victor Vance. Why is Victor Vance, Charles Sterling's daughter, and Victor? I did not look at my father right away. I kept my eyes on Ethan at the altar, and I walked with my chin up and my shoulders back and Victor's arms steady under my hand. And I let the room absorb what it was seeing. I let the murmur build and then settle. I let the silence that followed it say everything that I had declined to say out loud. And then, because I am my father's daughter in at least one way, I timed it. Halfway down the aisle, I glanced left. My father's face had undergone a transformation that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. It had begun, I was told later by my cousin who was seated 2 rows back, as recognition. The moment he registered Victor Vance, there had been a flinch, small but visible, the physical equivalent of a man who has stepped onto what he thought was solid ground and felt it shift. Then had come a kind of rapid, visible recalculation, his eyes moving from Victor to me to the guests around him and back again, processing the implications, the magnitude, the audience, the precision of it. By the time I was level with his row, what was on his face was not anger. Anger would have been manageable for him. He could perform anger as strength. What was on his face was something he could not perform his way out of, something too genuine and too sudden to mask. Devastation. Victor looked at him as we passed. It was not a smirk. It was not a sneer. It was a single deliberate nod, the slight incline of the chin that says, in the vocabulary of men who have spent decades in boardrooms together, "I see you. I know exactly what this is, and so does everyone in this room." My father's jaw tightened. His hands, folded in his lap, became fists. I looked away and walked the rest of the aisle toward the man I was marrying. The ceremony was beautiful. Ethan cried during the vows, which I absolutely had predicted, and I cried a little too, which I had promised myself I wouldn't, but which, when the moment arrived, was entirely beyond my control. The officiant was a friend from college who had gotten ordained specifically for the occasion, and he spoke about love as a practice rather than a feeling, something you chose and rebuilt every day. And I heard those words land on me with a weight that was probably not about the ceremony at all. Victor sat in the front row on the right side, across the aisle from my father. He watched the ceremony with an expression of what I can only describe as genuine pleasure, the unaffected satisfaction of a man who has done something good and knows it. I did not look at my father during the ceremony. I had decided in the planning of this day that he did not get to be a presence in those moments. He got to be a guest. He did not get to be a participant. When Ethan and I were pronounced married and he kissed me, the room erupted, and I let myself exist entirely in that sound, in the warmth and the joy of it, in the feeling of Ethan's hand on my face, and the flowers, and the light, and the life we were beginning. The reception was held in the estate's main ballroom, all marble and candlelight and round tables with centerpieces that my planner had described as old money opulence, which seemed fitting. The band was exceptional. The food was extraordinary. The guests moved through the room in the particular way that good parties generate momentum, and for a few hours, it was simply a wedding. A beautiful, specific, deeply personal wedding. My father remained. This surprised me. I had half expected him to leave after the ceremony, to cut his losses and retreat from the battlefield with whatever dignity he could salvage. But Charles Sterling did not retreat. Retreating was an admission of defeat, and he had not yet, I could see it from across the room, fully accepted what had happened. He was still processing, still calculating, still looking for the move. There was no move. The toasts began after dinner. My bridesmaids were wonderful. Ethan's best man, his childhood friend from Columbus, gave a toast so genuinely funny and tender that the room was laughing and tearing up simultaneously. Ethan's mother, a warm, round-faced woman who had embraced me with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of someone who simply did not believe love needed to be earned, spoke for 3 minutes and left half the room reaching for napkins. Then Victor Vance stood up. There was an immediate shift in the room's energy. Not an immediate hush, exactly, but an increased attention and awareness that something significant was about to happen. Victor accepted the microphone from the MC with the unhurried calm of a man who had addressed rooms far larger and far more adversarial than this one, and he stood for a moment, looking around the ballroom with an expression that was almost fond. He raised his glass. "I want to speak about what family actually means," he began, in the measured, resonant voice of someone who understands that pace and silence are as important as words. I've spent a great deal of my life in rooms where people talk about legacy, about names, about what is worth protecting and what is worth investing in. I have sat across tables with men who confuse wealth with worth and power with love. And I have watched that confusion cost them everything that actually mattered. The room was very quiet. "I met Chloe recently," he continued, "and in a short time I came to understand something about her that any reasonable person could see within 5 minutes of her company. She is exceptional, not because of her name or her background, because of her character, because of the choice she made to love a good man with courage and without apology, in the face of pressure designed to diminish her." He looked at Ethan. "Ethan," he said, "I did not know you before today, but I know what you do. You sit with small children in some of their most frightened moments, and you make those moments bearable. In the accounting system that actually matters, that is worth more than most of what I've spent my life accumulating." He paused. "Take care of her. You clearly already know how." Ethan pressed his lips together. His mother was crying again. Then Victor looked out at the room, and his voice shifted, just slightly, just enough that you could feel the room lean forward. "I also want to mark this occasion with a gift," he said, "because weddings should be celebrated generously, and because I believe in the principle that actions have consequences, that courage should be rewarded, and that there are moments when the universe requires a little assistance in delivering justice." He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope, which he set on the table in front of him with deliberate casualness. "As of this morning," he said, "I have completed the transfer of 14% of Sterling Technologies' outstanding shares to Chloe Calloway, née Sterling. These are Class A voting shares, representing a significant strategic holding." He picked up his glass again. "Chloe, you now have a seat on your father's board." The room detonated. Not loudly, not all at once. It was the particular kind of detonation that happens when 200 very intelligent, very well-informed people simultaneously understand the implications of something. It moved through the ballroom the way the murmur had moved through the ceremony hall. Row by row, table by table, a spreading and widening understanding that built into a sound that was part laughter, part awe, part the particular collective intake of breath that happens when someone has executed something so perfectly that the room simply has to acknowledge it. I had known. Victor and I had discussed it at our third meeting, 2 days before the wedding. He had already owned a significant position in Sterling Technologies, an investment from years earlier that my father had always found deeply uncomfortable. The transfer, he had told me, was not a spontaneous decision. He had been considering it for months, had thought about what to do with the position, and had realized when he met me that there was a destination that made a kind of beautiful, complete sense. I sat at the head table and watched my father. He was very still. That was the first thing. The usual performance of composure had stopped, not collapsed into visible emotion, but simply stopped, the way a machine stops when a critical component fails. He was sitting very straight in his chair, and he was staring at Victor Vance with an expression that I had never seen on his face in all my years of studying it. He looked lost. Not angry, not calculating, not managing the room, lost. The way a man looks when the story he has been telling himself, the one where he is the architect of every outcome, the one where his power is total and his control is absolute, encounters an event that the story simply cannot accommodate. His name was in every whisper now. I could see it in the way people glanced at him, then looked away, then glanced back. The social geography of the room had shifted entirely. He was no longer the most powerful person present. Victor had always held that position, but he was now the most visible, in the worst possible way. He was the man at his own daughter's wedding who had been outmaneuvered so completely that the evidence was sitting in an envelope on a table 15 feet away. He stood up. The movement attracted attention because Charles Sterling did not make unplanned movements. Several heads turned. He straightened his jacket with the automatic precision of a man whose grooming was reflexive at this point, beyond conscious control. He looked across the room at me. I met his eyes. I was not smiling. I was not triumphant. I was simply looking at him the way you look at someone you have finally, completely seen. He looked away first. He walked toward the exit of the ballroom with the careful, controlled gait of a man who was exercising every remaining resource of dignity in service of not running. He passed through the doors without stopping, without speaking to anyone, without the goodbye that social custom required. And then he was gone. My cousin, seated near the back, told me later that when he reached the lobby, he stopped. That he stood alone in that marble foyer for a long moment, his back to the room, his shoulders doing something she couldn't quite name. And then, she said, quietly enough that she was almost not sure she'd seen it, Charles Sterling bent his head. She said she thought he was crying. I danced with Ethan for 3 hours. We danced badly and joyfully, and without any concern for how we looked, which is the only way to dance at your own wedding. Victor stayed for another hour, drank a single glass of good scotch, spoke warmly with Ethan's mother for a remarkably long time, and left with the same quiet authority with which he'd arrived. Before he went, he found me on the dance floor and took my hand. "Well done," he said. "Thank you," I said, "for all of it." He nodded once, that same slight incline of the chin, and then he was gone, and I turned back to Ethan and let the music be the only thing. That was 8 months ago. I sit on my father's board now. The first meeting I attended 2 months after the wedding, he walked into the boardroom and stopped when he saw me at the table. It was only a half second, but I saw it. Then he sat down and the meeting proceeded with the professional efficiency of people who have learned to operate in the presence of fundamental conflict. We have not spoken about the wedding. We have not spoken in any real sense about anything. I am not sure we ever will. There is a version of this story where he comes to me eventually, where years have a softening effect and he finds his way to an apology. Maybe. I have decided not to arrange my life around that possibility. What I have arranged my life around is Ethan, who made us a garden in window boxes on our apartment balcony last spring, and who still drives the Honda Civic, and who last month was named head of the pediatric floor at his hospital, which he accepted with the kind of genuine, glowing happiness that made me feel like the whole city was a little brighter for a day. I have arranged my life around the understanding that love is not a performance, and family is not a bloodline, and the people who stand beside you are not the ones who were assigned to you, but the ones who showed up. Victor Vance sent us a wedding gift that arrived 3 weeks after the reception, a card, handwritten, that said only, "Legacy is not what you inherit, it is what you choose to build, and who you choose to build it with. You chose well." I have it framed on the wall of our apartment, right next to the terrible watercolor Ethan hung there the first week we moved in together, without any irony at all, just because I made it.